Every lifter wants to know, how often should I train to get stronger and be better at the lifts? Having coached both 3-day-a-week hobbyists and full-time national team athletes, I've seen what works, and let me break it down for you in these 5 points. Firstly, what is the ideal frequency for each lift? So before we consider ideal frequency for any lift, we have to consider 2 things. 1, what are our goals? What are the goals for this training cycle? Are we focused more on developing skill, as in learning the lifts, practicing the lifts, developing the qualities necessary to execute the lift with efficiency? Or are we worried more about capacity, the ability to tolerate a large amount of work, the strength and power we need to move heavier weights, the absolute load on the bar? Those 2 factors are going to indicate to us how much frequency is something we should be biasing towards. More skill, we want more frequency. More capacity, we probably can't tolerate as much frequency. So we have to understand first, what is the actual thing we're trying to develop? What's our goal? And that's going to impact the amount of training sessions we can have in a week and the frequency of a lift. The second is the amount of training volume we're doing. Now, volume is already impacted by skill and capacity, but at the same time, we also have to know what is the athlete's ability to recover from a session. If we have high skill, high frequency weeks, volume is going to have an impact on how often we can do those training sessions. If an athlete is training with a lot of repetitions for a lot of sets at moderate weights, they can probably have a frequency that's 3 or 4 times a week without too much trouble. If the athlete is training with high intensity and they're doing a relatively moderate amount of volume, meaning not too much, then frequency can come down a bit to accommodate for the extra intensity. If the athlete has a hard time with recovery and they need to do a lot of skill practice, we have to be very, very strategic in how we program. So we might need to reduce frequency a little bit to accommodate for that extra recovery need without reducing the exposure to constant stimulus to get their skill qualities to elevate or to improve their actual technical abilities. So these factors are going to play into how much frequency you can have in a single week for any one exercise. Let's look a little bit closer at just averages or regular training programs we see and how much frequency we would have in each exercise category. So looking at the snatch, we can look at a very broad range here, but essentially 2 to 6 times per week in the snatch. Now, the reason the range is so broad in the snatch is that 1, we know we want to have a lot of exposure to the snatch because it's the most technical of the lifts. We're going to want to constantly be in touch with what the snatch feels like so we can elevate the frequency for sure. As well as the fact that the snatch is the lightest of the movements, we can train it more often. When you snatch 2 times a week, or an athlete is snatching 2 times a week, let's imagine that that athlete is training 5 or 6 days a week. Someone training that low frequency would be someone who has extremely high strength levels or has a really poor recovery ability. Now, low frequencies like 2 times a week in the snatch are much more common when you have someone who's training, let's say 2 or 3 days a week, in which case there just aren't enough sessions to have them snatching every single day and still allocate volume and training to the other exercises you need. So low frequency is only good in the snatch if the athlete needs a lot of time to recover, in which case they just can't do that many sessions, or if they are training a very limited number of days. Ideally though, in the snatch, we want to maximize the number of training sessions we can so we can get the most exposure to the technical elements of the snatch and keep that tactile feel of snatching as on the surface as possible. Right next to your ability to do it, you have to be practicing regularly. I would say that in average, you're going to find an athlete training the snatch probably the same number of times they train the week. So if you have a 4-day program, you're probably snatching almost every day, if not every day. If you have a 3-day program, definitely probably every session you train, you're going to do a snatch. As you get to higher frequencies, say 5 times a week, you might only snatch 4 of those days and allocate 1 day as a day for clean and jerks or something else where you don't have to constantly be in touch. People's shoulder injuries, elbow injuries, anything that precludes you from snatching frequently would also have an impact on this, but that's a very deep and dark rabbit hole to go down because there's a million possible options. So know that the average number of sessions you're going to get in a snatch is going to be on the high side, right? High frequency is better. That's our goal for the snatch because we want lots of exposure to the technical elements. The clean and jerk. Because the clean and jerk is heavier, we aren't going to be able to do as much frequency as we would in the snatch. So I would say at most, you're going to see probably between 1 and 4 times a week. That would be for the clean and jerk itself, or if you broke the 2 lifts up, they would be the same, between 1 and 4 times a week. One time per week in the clean and jerk would only be acceptable, in my opinion, if somebody was very, very strong or again had really poor recovery abilities and they needed to do just a very limited number of sessions with the clean and jerk. Somebody who has injuries, bad knees, bad elbows, whatever it is, they might be limited in the amount they can do. So very low frequency, again, not great in the clean and jerk, but you can get away with it because it's much less technical than the snatch. You don't need quite as much of a feel for the lift to make sure that you're actually able to do it with high intensity. So I would say the frequency there is more moderate, meaning that it can be, towards the higher side, but not necessarily as high as the snatch. I would still recommend your clean jerking, 1 less day than your number of training days per week. So if you have a 4-day program, you're clean and jerking or doing some variation of clean and jerk on 3 of those 4 days. If you're training 5 days a week, at least 3 to 4 of those days would be clean and jerk. If you're training 6 days or more, it could probably still stay at about 4 sessions a week. More than that might be too much and might interfere with the snatching as well. Again, it's dependent on the amount of training volume you're doing. If your clean and jerk is super weak, you might do 4 or 5 days, but I would say on the high side, 4 sessions of clean and jerk is definitely gonna be hitting the mark there. Pulling. So I put pulling at 0 to 6 times a week. And the reason for this, as far as frequency goes, is pulling can be done for a variety of different reasons, right? So pulling can be done for a low volume when you're developing strength qualities. If you're doing deadlifts as a way to just build strength capacity and you're doing maybe 1 session of deadlift, 1 session of RDL, and that's all you're doing with pulls, then a low number of frequency is totally fine there. 1 to 2 times is totally okay. If you're doing pulls in conjunction with the lifts or as a primer or as a technical element, you can increase the frequency. So we could have pulls being done as many as 6 times a week if they're done low intensity, maybe to focus on or target a particular weakness. A good example of this would be, let's say somebody struggles with finishing the extension in the snatch and you want to do something like a snatch pull to a target where they do a snatch high pull and they try to hit the bar against a lip or a barbell in the rack or a PVC pipe. And it's a way for them to really hone in and practice that particular element. You might do that with 80% of your snatch or 90% of your snatch, a weight that's very low intensity, not super fatiguing, but you can do it as a primer exercise or you can do it after the fact as a little tune-up to get your skill sort of improved. So it's not necessarily a pure strength exercise, it's much more of a drill. So that's why I say that frequency can be high in the pulls if technique is your goal. So we could have high frequency in the pulls if 4 to 6 times a week, if your overall goal is technical in nature, not for strength development. I'd recommend most of the time you're doing pulls probably in conjunction with the lift. So if you're snatching 4 times a week, you would be doing pulls 2 to 4 times a week to augment that process if needed. Now, on the other side of the coin, if you don't do any pulls, that's also fine. Many successful programs have had 0 pulling in them at all, and athletes have been just fine. So understand that if you're gonna use pulls, you can do them in a very broad range of intensities and frequencies and get what you need out of it, but adjust the frequency to what you're doing. If you're doing pulls for strength, you don't need to be doing 6 sessions of pulls a week. If you're doing pulls for technical elements, you can do more of them. Just know that they're gonna be lighter and mostly focused on technique. The middle round is really just gonna be 1 to 2 sessions of pulls for each movement, for snatch and for clean. So that would be somewhere around 2 to 4 sessions of pulling total in the week. That's probably where most people are gonna be sitting in general. Real quick, if you're tired of guessing your training, check out Weightlifting AI. It's a program I designed to adapt every workout to you, your goals, your schedule, and your recovery. Whether you're a beginner hitting your first snatch PR, a master's lifter trying to train for masters nationals, or a competitor prepping for a meet, the program adjusts as you train. Thousands of lifters are already using it to get stronger and more consistent. Click the link in the description and sign up today. Now, probably the most varied of all of them, squatting. What is the ideal frequency for squatting? This is a big question. I think this is probably the most The most frequently asked question I would get about squatting. One, the question is, how many times a week should I squat to get the most leg strength? And then, is there a limit to the amount of times I should squat that's actually beneficial? So I put 2 to 6 here as the range, and the reality is the range could be any number above that. When I personally trained with the Bulgarians, we had, I think, about 18 squat sessions a week. That's obviously on the super high end. Know that when you're increasing the frequency of something, you have to decrease the magnitude of the training of that thing to accommodate for the extra sessions and the extra volume, which means that those sessions become somewhat less significant in driving results, right? Once you get above 3 or 4 sessions a week of squatting, most of those other sessions you're adding are probably pointless. They're just practice, or they're very light or very low intensity and really just end up being junk volume, so it's probably not super useful. Now, in the case of somebody who maybe would benefit from more frequent squatting, where they get exposure to squatting movements on a regular basis, but not giant sessions, that might be a beneficial situation where I would say, yes, 6 sessions of squat could be okay if somebody needed a lot of primer or a lot of practice doing squats to augment something in the lift. It's very rare that I would even consider that, but it is possible. So I wouldn't say that it's something to avoid, just you'd have to be a unique situation to need high frequencies like that. For most people, squatting is gonna be best done at moderate intensities, right? So kind of in this moderate range of 2 to 4 times. Imagine the amount of squatting you're doing has to drive results in the squat. So adding another session of squatting in when you're not making progress with 4 sessions is probably not the answer. If you're squatting once a week and you add another squat session in and your squat starts to climb, that's great. Maybe add a third one in, you're gonna get even more progress. But if you start to see that more frequency in the squat does not drive results, it's not the answer to just keep doing more sessions. The squat every day sort of methodology can be effective in short periods of time, but over the long course of training, if your goal is only to use squats to build leg strength, you just don't need super high frequencies. This has been shown time and time again. 2 to 3 to 4 times a week squatting is definitely the sweet spot for 95% of the population. Much higher than that, and you're gonna start to reduce volume so much in those sessions that they become basically just practice sessions to the skill of squatting, which is not the sport of weightlifting. We don't care how good we are at squatting. We care that our squat is driving the results of the snatch and clean and jerk. So the ideal range, I would say, is somewhere between 2 to 4 times a week. And it really depends, again, on how much progress you're making. If you can maximize these sessions and reduce an entire session of squatting to go from 4 to 3 and still maintain the same level of progress, you're gonna be in a better spot because that frees up a lot more time for the other exercises to be placed in the program, which are more important than squatting. So again, squatting, moderate frequency, but there are certain situations where I would say super low or super high frequency could be beneficial for somebody, but it'd have to be a very exceptional case, and you'd really have to base that on the individual themselves. Second, recovery dictates frequency. So the principle of SRA, stimulus recovery adaptation, drawn out here expertly by yours truly, explains what happens. When you apply a stimulus, a training session, a workout, you have a decrease in performance. Then as you cease that exercise and start to recover, you're going to pass baseline and then adapt and have a super compensation or an increase in your abilities that you had before. So as simply stated, this curve, the time from this point to this point, is going to be different for every single thing you do, whether it's 3 sets of 3 snatch at 80% or 10 sets of 10 back squat at RPE 10. This curve changes based on what you do. So we want to maximize frequency. We have to look at this chart and optimize our sessions to make this fit what we're trying to accomplish. So understand that you can increase frequency if you have large sessions and small sessions in a week. Let's say we have 4 sessions planned in the snatch, and we know the amount of training volume we're doing from our calculation of total volume. We can then look and say, let's make some of those sessions bigger that have a bigger impact, where we're gonna use more volume, maybe even more intensity, and then place smaller sessions in line so that we can do 2 things: keep skill practice frequent, and allow for recovery without disrupting this process. So we might see something like a really big session here take place, and that drives our abilities down, we're fatigued. But then before we actually recover, maybe this whole span is 4 days, right? So from here to here is 4 days. If we did nothing in those 4 days, we wouldn't really practice the skill anymore, and we'd lose touch with the movement. The next session we did, we'd be sloppy, we'd be sort of figuring it out as we go, it wouldn't be as effective. But let's say at day number 2 or 3, we put a little bit of a recovery session here, a little lightweight snatch session that's relatively hard and uses variations that are challenging but don't load the body with a tremendous amount of weight. We cannot disrupt this process and still recover without having a negative impact. But what do? We get more frequent skill practice. When we think about SRA, we have to think about how do we structure our volume in the week and the frequency to maximize both the exposure to technical skill, so high frequency, multiple sessions a week, with the magnitude of training we need to do in a single session to make progress. So we have large sessions and small sessions. We intersperse them without disrupting this curve by placing small technical sessions into the week in places that make sense. That's why something like a snatch could have 4 sessions a week of training without being super disruptive. Or something like a clean and jerk, we don't need as much technical exposure, so maybe we don't need to put this little clean and jerk workout in here. We can get away with 4 days between a clean and jerk because they're so much heavier and the technical skill is not as demanding. And then even more so with something like a squat. You could have a squat on day 1 here, and then let's say all the way over here is day 4. You don't need another squat session in between those because you're not gonna forget how to squat. So you can have lower frequency with larger number of days between those sessions. So SRA is our governing principle for the structure of a week and what we do with the frequency we've determined for the lift. Higher frequency can be used as long as we're interspersing larger and smaller sessions, and lower frequency, we can apply this principle and look at it and say, how often should we squat? Well, we don't need to do it every single day, so we can space it out day 1, day 3, day 4, whatever it is, and then plan our weeks around that. Some examples of how frequency manifests itself in different systems. Let's just take a quick look at 3 sort of unique systems: the Bulgarian, the Russian, and the United States. I would define these as the US system is a moderate frequency, usually about 3 to 4 days a week, 5 days a week, with a high intensity focus, much less so on total training volume. The Bulgarian system, obviously very high frequency, very high intensity, but relatively lower volume compared to the other systems. And then the Russian system is a high frequency, higher volume system with moderate intensities. So you can look at how the interplay between frequency, volume, and intensity manifests itself in very different ways in 3 different training systems. Think about this when you consider how much frequency you add to a program, how you structure the program, what you're doing overall. This is a governing principle for overall training. Keep frequency in check, keep volume and intensity in check, but they all play off of each other. Oh, God. I knew it was wrong as soon as I put my pen down. Point number 4, how to use frequency to build consistency. The most important factor here is to maximize the weekly number of sessions you're training with. If you can increase the exposure to the exercise, you will become more consistent. Now, we talked about it before that you have to intersperse large and hard training sessions with easier and lighter training sessions, but at the same time, we can kind of fudge that a little bit by making more sessions a little bit more consistent in size. If we have a lot of sessions that are relatively similar, we can have more even spacing of those sessions and we can build a little bit more consistency. If consistency is your biggest problem, you can maximize the number of sessions you train with by reducing the volume of your sessions and spreading them out more aggressively through the week. So you could have 6 sessions of snatch and build up a lot more consistency around that movement by having it happen every single training session. Again, consistency versus the trade-off of building more power or more strength is going to be something you have to weigh out. But higher frequencies will almost always result in more consistency. The key here is to not overdo it and spend so much time becoming consistent that you don't actually become strong, which is the ultimate goal of weightlifting. Point number 5, how I do it. So this is how I allocate training frequency and how I've trained and built our Weightlifting AI to allocate training frequency as well. The first thing is we look at individual differences. What athlete are we working with? Are they heavy? Are they light? How many days a week do they want to train? All of these factors come into play for us to pick out the perfect training frequency for them. The second thing I would look at is the mesocycle goal. Are they in a GPP mesocycle, in which case frequency might be lower for something like the snatch, but higher for something like pulls or squats? That has an impact on the total frequency we're going to have in the week. If they're in a special preparatory phase, the snatch and clean and jerk frequency is going to climb up because we want to have more exposure to those lifts. If we're in a competition phase or a competition mesocycle, are they going to be doing more heavy lifts, in which case frequency should come down a little bit to maximize the amount of recovery they have between those sessions? And then finally, the total training volume the athlete's going to do. We generally calculate training volume based on the frequency, but in this case, if we know that the athlete is very small and very weak and very light, and they're going to train 5 days a week, we already know they're going to do a higher frequency as it is. So those sessions are going to be a little bit smaller, but much more frequent. So we adjust everything based on these factors to get the right amount of frequency. The primary thing with frequency, like we talked about so many times now, is recovery and skill acquisition. The more skill we need, or the more time we want them to spend training the skill, the higher the frequency should be. The larger and more aggressive the sessions are, the more we have to undulate between larger and smaller sizes to manufacture a session or a weekly structure that gives them the best recovery without sacrificing exposure to the lift so they can practice the skill as often as possible. If you like this video, subscribe and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested, check out the previous video in this series, Training Volume.